Is Deathstate even a horror game?
Ish? Eldritch Horror Code of Paint, so there's like Star Children and Skill.
Alright, good enough for me. Hello everyone, I'm Sean, and this is Deathstate.
And I'm Arlian. You can't see it, but I'm slow blinking at you, man. And for those watching, we'll be reviewing indie studio Bread Machine Games' Deathstate, a roguelite bullet hell that's been infused with a dash of Lovecraft.
But is it a solid Halloween treat?
Or does Bread Machine's game come off as half-baked?
Can we do one episode without a pun? Whatever. Find out now today on this episode of Critical Reviews. Deathstate is dripping with Lovecraftian influences. But that's basically where the horror aspects of this game start and end. Mechanically, there really is not all that much to it as far as the controls go. The game automatically targets nearby enemies and automatically shoots at them. So your only job when you're in the thick of it is to pick a direction and float in. And I want to put an emphasis on float. Generally speaking, I felt the movement sort of felt like you were skating around on ice. And you will be doing a lot of that. Deathstate is a bullet hell disguised as a dungeon crawler. And so dodging those constant barrages of enemy projectiles is going to be your main concern. I personally found this to make for a fairly boring game in which all the actual level of agency I had in any given situation was very minimal beyond my ability to skate around.
And given that you can't manually shoot your bullets in the general vicinity of enemies, but in fact auto-target enemies that are close to you, the game essentially obligates you to get close to the teeming horde of enemies, forcing you into a deadly dance of dodging and decimating. Yes, alliteration for the win. That said, you do have a few tricks up your sleeve. First off, you have a dodge key, which is not only useful for being able to get a quick burst of speed for evasive purposes, it also allows you a brief moment of invulnerability where you can safely collide into bullets and cancel them out. Secondly, all characters have a starting spell unique to them, which you generate mana for by murdering/damaging enemies. Given these range from basic bursts of bullets to such gameplay changes as the Madman's ability to become briefly invulnerable, the Priest's ability to dispel nearby bullets, or even eyes, yeah, it's a floating eye, its ability to fire a rotating field of death lasers, yeah, they're pretty handy. Oh, and before we forget, whilst there isn't a button to manually fire bullets, there is one to prevent yourself from shooting. Whilst you're not likely to use this much in the basic difficulty of the game, in the game's Desecration and Insanity modes, a number of enemies explode into bullets upon dying, so occasionally pausing from the slaughter can actually save your life.
To add some nuance to the gameplay, though I personally use the word nuance a bit loosely here, there are weapons, grimoires, potions, and organs. These fill a pretty routine role as far as bullet hells are concerned. Weapons increase bullet damage, bullet speed, or bullet density, or can add a different type of bullet to your arsenal, or give you an area of effect of some sort that allows you to nuke a general area. Grimoires function as a mobile turret that follows the player and can target multiple enemies. You can also carry a single potion that does a variety of effects, from simple health restoration to zooming in on your character and decreasing your field of view. Yeah, not all potion effects are beneficial, so try to use those with caution.
I will say that while the potions are randomized per run, once you've drank one, your character will recognize that for the rest of that run, and the potion's effects for a particular color remain likewise static during that run. Which is more useful than you'd think, given that if you visit a shop, the skeleton shopkeeper's potions are pre-identified, so if he's selling a poison potion and it's red, it basically gives you a hint not to get red potions for the rest of that run. Or you can be lazy and play the scientist who just auto-identifies all potions she encounters, and randomly chugs a potion as her spell. Anyways, back to you, Sean.
And lastly, there's organs, which are like passives that you keep for that run. Unfortunately, there's no real way to control which organs you get or how many you get, and this game likes to do that thing that roguelike games are so fond of, where sometimes you will just get nothing in terms of drops for a run, and then other times you'll absolutely be rolling in more organs than you could possibly ever need.
True. Painfully true at times, with the major exception to this being that on every floor there is a champion monster of sorts. A more powerful variant of the monsters you're fighting, albeit with more complex bullet patterns and a larger health pool. Distinctive by their distorted color palette and the fiendish laughter that literally accompanies them when they spot you, there's a minimum of one of these guys per dungeon floor, and they always drop at least one organ. Bosses also are guaranteed to drop at least one organ. Otherwise, you're basically praying to RNGesus every time you open one of the large challenge crates that is going to spit out an organ that helps you, or hoping that the skeletal shopkeeper has one for you, since he can totally put them on sale occasionally. But yeah, emphasis on hoping they help you, given that they don't actually tell you what stats they'll give you until after you pick them up. Sure, they're generally more good than bad, but well, losing max health is never fun. It sucks when your attack rate drops when you're using a slow weapon to start with, or one that relies on speed. Flames much. Also, a loss of move speed in this game is tantamount to suicide, especially with the slow characters such as the priest. Also, on the note of champions, there's also certain named enemies that you can encounter with very specific abilities, and they actually have a title. Their drops come from a rather specific pool of items which contain certain items, weapons, and organs specific to that enemy, some of which are inordinately powerful.
I've repeatedly mentioned that Deathstate is a bullet hell, and while that is true, the game is also a roguelike dungeon crawler. And so you know what that means: random floor plans and a complete loss of level progression upon death. It also has a time limit, though this one isn't a starvation mechanic at least. Instead, after a certain amount of time, you'll get an indication that you should leave the stage, and a slowly creeping wall of damaging yellow death engulfs the stage from the bottom upwards. Each level is 3 floors and then a boss floor. A basic run with no difficulty modifiers will see you try to fight your way through various levels to get to the end and unlock the ending specific to whichever character you have chosen for your run. While there are a decent chunk of levels, a single run will only really see you having to tackle 4 to maybe 5 of them to get to the end, which is good because there's at least 8 levels with 3 floors and a boss fight each. Tackling them all in a single run would be tedious to say the least.
Also, you can thankfully save at any point and just leave and return to that level, which is nice. Though, you'll have to start that level that you saved at from scratch, so no saving in the middle of clearing it. Still, whilst initially you only have access to the Fortress of Koth when you start a new game, once you've cleared it, you'll unlock the Temple of Kit? QIT, whatever. The Temple of QIT is an alternate area with different enemies and challenges, keeping the experience fresh and avoiding the endless repetition of mastering one particular world instead of enemies. Likewise, the next 2 worlds also unlock alternates once cleared. The only 2 worlds which are relatively static in how you access them is the Lost Arcanium, which is always accessed as the final world, and the Dark World, which is accessed at first via specific enemy creature's ability, where it just sort of warps you there, and from that point onwards can also be accessed via crystalline portals. Unlike the other worlds, the Dark World is unique for not only being completely optional, but also potentially accessible at any point of the game. While possessing creatures with some of the highest health, damage, and lethal attack patterns, it has the trade-off of giving you potential access to 4 more organs than you might normally obtain, as well as certain unique champions that can be encountered there that drop extremely powerful organs and weapons.
Deathstate is one of those games where almost every unlockable thing in the game is attached to some task that is usually doing a thing in a certain way or a certain amount of times. I've never been a fan of this kind of gameplay, especially when it requires that you beat the game multiple times. Basically, characters can be unlocked through stuff like causing enemies to flee a certain amount of times or collecting a certain amount of power-ups. While there are more definitive unlocks for more obvious tasks like beating the game under certain conditions, a lot of the unlocks are going to feel extremely random due to the fact that you have very little control over when an enemy flees or when a power-up drops. There was one instance where Arlian was convinced that the Desecration Shrine, more on those later, were unlocked by beating the game, yet I managed to unlock them on my second level. I don't recall if we ever did figure out what the actual conditions of that unlock is, but the long and short, though, if you're not a completionist or you don't enjoy having to repeatedly beat a game to get the most out of it, most of Deathstate's content probably remain forever elusive to you.
On one hand, I generally found that I had a pretty good idea of how to unlock certain things once I figured out how to parse the hints given in the unlock book. And yeah, I had totally thought Desecration Shrines were unlocked via beating the game, but they're in fact unlocked by accessing an alternate world for the first time. I just did both simultaneously since I just kept wiping after Koth for the longest time and then just ran through the game straight through with the character and away I went. So it took properly reading the unlock book to figure out otherwise. But if you can figure out the hints given by the book, you can approach the game and how you're going to play it pretty tactically to unlock the various characters, and they all play fairly differently from each other due to their passives, abilities, and starting stats. Yeah, the game can be pretty harsh at times, especially given you're starting from scratch each run, and a number of these unlocks can be somewhat time intensive. But there's pretty good odds that a number of the more accessible ones will be unlocked via normal trial and error as players adjust to the gameplay.
You know, you could just admit that it was grindy from the start.
Fine, yes, okay, so there is some grind involved. Anyways, one of the major appeals to this game for me was its difficulty, which can be amped up in a few ways. One is the aforementioned Desecration Shrines, which, upon activation, spawn a boss creature, health bar drops and all, and ballin' battle music, and which promptly influences the rest of the game upon its demise. Or even, I think, upon its summoning, actually. Enemy bullet patterns become more complex, foes suddenly have more health, and eventually do more damage to you. And there's 3 of these in the game, which you'll need to unlock if you want to acquire the game's true ending, or unlock the items or characters associated with Desecration 3. There's also Insanity Mode, which pits the players against bullet patterns more aggressive and just as damaging as Desecration 3 from the start of the game, and which has an additional boss phase after every normal boss phase. This additional boss phase, at least from what I can determine from the first/only one I got to encounter, is comprised of 2 of the Desecration Shrine bosses fought at the same flippin' time.
And then there's like this endless mode, which just randomly bounces you through the various stages of the game, while enemies slowly gain in health and damage. There's a number of items that can only be unlocked by boss drops in this mode, as well as clearing certain bosses in Insanity Mode. These mainly seem to be there for the challenge completionist factor, since you can unlock all of the game's story without ever venturing inside this mode. I never personally bothered with Endless Mode myself. The grindy nature of this game was off-putting enough as it was for me, without wanting to add even more grind to the mix. And lastly, there's this really poorly defined mechanic in play that is never really explained in the game at all. It actually took players figuring out it was there through trial and error that this mechanic did in fact exist. So during your exploration of any given floor, there's this weird discoloration that will slowly pass along the screen It gives the color palette a sort of negative exposure appearance. While it is easy to mistake this for mere ambience as I did, turns out this is the Deathstate. What does it do, you may ask? But while you're within the boundaries of the effect, you do more damage and item drops are increased. It is so easy to miss this most of the time because you're generally too involved in dodging bullets to contemplate whether or not you're doing more damage or items are dropping more frequently. It's just kind of weird that such a major mechanic was left completely undefined by the game devs. But I guess it isn't the first time that the developers of a game snuck in some hidden mechanic.
Yeah, the only real hint I got of its existence was the weird-ass modifiers on some items, which said things like dark seeking, black eye, or dark damage, and I then went and looked up, and which are all tied to making that darkness pop up longer, more often, or make you murder better while you're sitting inside it. So, thank God for the magic of game wikis.
Well, if you haven't gathered it by now, I'll go ahead and put as fine a point on it as I can. I personally didn't enjoy this game. Mechanically, it held zero appeal for me. Put as much time into it as I could before I finally just had to walk away and accept that Deathstate is not my kind of game. In doing so, I did not really get to see much of the story. And because I wasn't personally invested in the game, what little story I did gather really failed to stick. What I did gather is that while on its surface, Deathstate is a Lovecraftian themed game, the developers went for more of a comedic approach. It definitely isn't a horror game beyond certain aesthetical choices, and the story is more goofy, tongue-in-the-cheek romp more than anything else.
So, basically, you're introduced to the story in an opening cutscene, but from there it's more or less just happy to let you romp about the horrible other dimension, murdering to your heart's content, offering you lore about the creatures and its world through item descriptions as you find them, and enemy descriptions as you slaughter enough. And it's here that the game leans heaviest on its Lovecraftian inspiration, as some of those descriptions feel like they'd be right at home in a book. That said, Sean is correct in saying that the game has a comedic bent. From the small blurbs from creatures as you venture to the next level, to some of the other game, like the item descriptions, and then finally to the endings for the various characters, one of which is just looking for his lost cat. Yeah, that one still gets me. But yeah, the game balances its gore with just sillier moments. I was pretty fond of the way that the story progressed, but I did find grinding out unknown amounts of enemies to get the full lore descriptions a lot less palatable than just clearing the game with a specific character. 24 hours of game time in, and I'm still missing a bunch of boss and enemy lore.
Now, one of the few caveats that I am personally willing to give this game is that it has a very nice art style. Bullet hells can easily become sort of a sensory overload with all the brightly colored objects on screen, but Deathstate handles this very well by utilizing its color palettes, which are more subdued to prevent being blinded by an onslaught of flashing lights and bouncing objects. It's designed to look like an older game and does very well at this while not losing details in its character and creation design, as can sometimes happen with these games that intentionally go for a more low-res aesthetic.
Honestly, I really like Deathstate's overall aesthetic. The depiction of the different attacks, the various enemies, and especially the boss fights and the player characters. There's just something really distinctly satisfying in some of these encounters for their visuals. The only thing that really stuck out for me as a negative is actually the Deathstate mechanic, that rolling wave of darkness that would slide across the screen. Sometimes it would make it difficult for me to see oncoming bullets because I'd grown so acclimatized to their typical color that when they were suddenly inverted, it just threw me for a loop.
The music also gets a thumbs up from me. It was deliciously retro and energetic. Deathstate's sound design manages to excellently blend the synth-heavy melodies that invoke memories of old-school Nintendo with the thumping bass beats of old-school Sega. If you had just handed me the OST for this game and told me that Deathstate was some sort of electronica artist, I would have probably legitimately believed you. The game's music is good, all on its own. And I mentioned earlier that the game does a good job of never overloading the senses. The sound effects never manage to take center stage over the game's soundtrack.
Can I just say same? Because, like, same. I literally have an active runtime of 24 hours of solid running through the, like, dungeon-y type worlds gameplay, not even counting just loitering in the library, and I still haven't gotten tired of the music. And that's, like, playing almost straight repeatedly. Combat is blissfully drowned by the soundtrack, so you never really have to deal with getting, like, inundated with incessant pew 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 noises. Oh, and the ambient noise from those critters are seriously fun and sort of squiggly. Especially the various evil laughs that the champion monsters give off when you encounter them.
Alright, so here we are at the end of the episode. And here's the thing. Deathstate is mechanically sound. It functions as intended and isn't buggy or broken. Everything in the game has a place and a purpose within its gameplay structure. It's just not my kind of game. If you don't like floaty controls, you won't like how Deathstate controls. If you don't like games with a lot of grind in them, you won't like Deathstate. If your idea of progress is wanting more than a new, harder difficulty for all your efforts, there isn't that much that getting further into the game offers you. I'm personally going to rate this game as a fumble. While part of me really wants to fail this game outright because it brought me zero enjoyment beyond its music and aesthetic, I recognize that it isn't the game's fault that it is the kind of game it is. Deathstate is exactly what it's supposed to be. It's just that what it is isn't for me.
So yeah, this is one of those games where there were mechanics both me and Sean weren't the largest fan of. Mutually, I believe we both sort of struggled with the grind aspect, but in this case, they weren't deal breakers for me, especially since I enjoyed the overall challenge of the game and didn't feel compelled to try and 100% it, thankfully. As it stands, I fundamentally enjoyed what the game had to offer, whether I was challenging myself to beat the game with the various characters to learn more, to go through the pains of upping the difficulty and death count to see the true ending, or even endeavoring to tackle the hardest challenges the game had to offer, and navigating both insanity and infinite mode. I found myself continually learning different tricks to make a bit more progress, which helped when the game refused to cough up those items that would just make or break the game for me. Sadly, I had to get good. Yeah, so I'd say if you're looking for a game that leans more towards the unforgiveness of roguelikes and relish that sort of challenge, this game is likely to be up your alley, especially if you're a fan of bullet hells and Toho likes. I'm actually generally not, and I was still quite keen on this game. I'm actually going to try and pull Sean into a little podcast, so you can stay tuned for that one, but that'll be us sort of sounding off our thoughts on what could have made it a bit more solid, like what he struggled with in regards to this game. And so yeah, stay tuned for that. Beyond that though, this game was superbly solid enough to me that I would consider it a crit hit.